that some of these issues don't get blown out to something much bigger than it needs to be. And so I think those are the kind of discussions that are important as we have mill-to-mill discussions. You know,
we'll leave this program and return to live coverage of the U.S. Senate now. Lawmakers coming back from their weekly party caucuses to debate National Labor Relations Board nominations and continued work on spending for the transportation and housing departments. Live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Madam President.
The senator from Georgia.
Yes, what state is the senator? Are we in a quorum call?
The Senate is not in a quorum call.
I'd like to be recognized for the purpose of making a brief remarks.
The senator from Georgia is recognized.
Madam President, I'm pleased to come to the floor, and I'll be joined shortly by Senator Murray from the state of Washington to announce that tomorrow in the Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, we will be introducing the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act. Quite honestly, the Workforce Investment Act was passed in 1998 and has not been reauthorized in the last 15 years. During that period of time, our country, particularly in the last 6 years, has gone through a sustained period of unemployment. We also have periods where employers can't find a match of workers who are actually trained for the jobs that they have. Workforce investment and training is important for those with disabilities, those without jobs, those with skill sets that need to be improved, and this bill addresses all of those. Senator Murray has been a tireless senator in working to find common ground on issues that have been critical to both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but more important, to the workers of the United States of America. I want to pay tribute to her staff, who has worked tirelessly with my staff, and I want to thank Tommy Nguyen on my staff in particular for his dedication and hard work. This bill represents a real step forward, and I'm pleased that this morning the Business Roundtable issued a release of their endorsement of the base bill that we're putting forward tomorrow in the committee. Hopefully it'll be on the floor this fall when we return from a summer recess and we can move forward on job training, job opportunity, and lowering the unemployment rate in the United States of America. In particular, I'm very pleased that this bill provides flexibility to our governors in terms of transferability of funds. It provides for business majorities on the boards and the business member to be a board chairman and the state chairman to also be a business person, which means those who are doing the employing will those that will be guiding the Workforce Development Act in their state. I'm also particularly proud of the fact that we focused on a regional approach to workforce investment. So oftentimes you get so many workforce investment boards in one metropolitan area, you have a very individualized focus and not a regional focus. A regional focus is important for workers. It's important for all of us. So I am pleased to announce today on my behalf, Senator Isaacson on the Help Committee, that along with Senator Murray, today we are introducing and tomorrow we will mark up in committee the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act, and I look forward to the support of all members of the Senate to help us do a better job providing jobs for working Americans. And I yield back my time, and no, I don't yield back my time. I can brag about her while she's here now because I've been saying nice things while you were on the way, Senator Murray, but I want to thank you for your cooperation, the spirit of cooperation that you've given us, and the fact that we finally reached an agreement between ourselves and our staffs. I met with my side this morning. I know you've done the same thing. We have a good platform to move forward on the first reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act since 1998, and I defer to the Senator from Washington.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
Madam President, I want to thank the senator. Senator Isaacson has been absolutely great to work with. We've been spending a lot of time on this. And let me just add a few remarks here. You know, over the past several weeks and months, we've spent a lot of time here in the Senate debating everything from the federal budget to separate spending bills, and throughout those debates, members of both parties have agreed that it is absolutely critical that we are working to write laws and policies that put hardworking Americans back to work and help our businesses grow and invest and position our economy to compete and win in the 21st century. Now, we've had some disagreement on how to achieve those goals, but as our nation now recovers from the recession, our first priority has to be getting Americans back on the job. So I want to join with Senator Isaacson today to talk about the tremendous progress that we have made in the Health Committee, and that is the work to reauthorize the Workforce Investment Act, and to do just that, put Americans back to work. Madam President, before I get to the importance of the bill itself, I do want to take some time to talk about the bipartisan process that we've had at the committee level to move this forward. From the very beginning of this process, I've worked very closely with my Republican co-sponsor, Senator Isaacson, who you just heard from, and though I know we represent very different states with different industries and different issues, we've each remained very committed to writing a bill that works for all American businesses and workers. This process has never been about scoring political points or pitting interests against each other. I think it's been a rare and needed example of true bipartisan legislating. And I really want to thank my friend Senator Isaacson again for his hard work and commitment throughout this process. I also want to thank our committee chairman and ranking members, Senator Harkin and Senator Alexander, who've both worked extensively on this legislation and have now signed on as co-sponsors as well. Madam President, it has been 15 years since we first passed the Workforce Investment Act, or WIA. But perhaps more importantly, it's been a full decade since the legislation was due to be reauthorized. So this law, which was first written in the late 1990s, was designed to be changed and updated back in 2003. And since then, as we all know, our country and our economy have changed a lot. In the late 1990s, the Internet was changing the way we do business and driving our economy, and the housing sector was as strong as ever. But as we all know, unfortunately, both of these industries went bust. But back then, we here in Congress were willing to take the long view and make meaningful commitments to and investments in our workforce development systems. So back in 1998, we wrote and passed the Workforce Investment Act to help our workers and educators and businesses respond to an economy that was changing faster than ever before. Now, lately we haven't done much of that, but I'm very optimistic that by improving and reauthorizing WIA, we can get back on track. This is the very law that was written to help us respond to a changing economy and really provide the framework for our nation's workforce development system. But it's still written to address the issues that we faced more than 10 years ago. So, Madam President, working with senators from both sides of the aisle and the business and labor and education communities, we are bringing to our committee tomorrow a very strong reauthorization bill that brings WIA into the 21st century. This bill puts more than a decade of experience and data to use by doing a couple of things. It requires a single unified workforce plan in each state and replaces all the overlap and confusion between separate state agencies. It recognizes that we need data and analysis to understand which workforce programs are working well, what makes them work well, and how to improve them, and just as importantly, which programs are underperforming and why, and how to fix them. And it makes the changes to align our workforce systems with regional economic development and labor markets. This bill is focused on using real-world data to measure the returns that we get on our workforce investments. And getting good return on our federal dollars we invest is exactly what Americans are calling for today. So while we're making important changes to the existing version of WIA, I want to finish my remarks today with an example of incredible success that this law has already had in helping our economy. Last year, the WIA adult and dislocated worker programs produced some really remarkable statistics. Over 1 million adults and dislocated workers were placed in jobs. Those workers earned more than $12 billion over just the first 6 months of their employment. And in that same period, WIA funds spent on those programs came to about $2 billion. So let me say that again. In just 6 months, an investment of $2 billion yielded return of more than $12 billion. So, Madam President, the investments that we make through WIA programs are having an incredible impact on our economy, and the important point is we can do more. And that's really why a lot of organizations across the country have called for a modernized 21st century version of the Workforce Investment Act. Organizations like the National Business Roundtable, the National Metropolitan Business Alliance, labor, education leaders, Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce in my home state, all of these organizations are supporting the efforts that we've put together. So, Madam President, we're here today to announce to our colleagues that tomorrow we're going to begin marking up our reauthorization bill in committee, and I look forward to continuing working with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle. You know, in a time when bipartisan legislation has become difficult to achieve, I hope that we can set an example of what we are still capable of doing together to really strengthen our country and our economy. And I again want to thank Senator Isaacson and all those who've worked really hard to put this bill together. I'm proud of what we've accomplished and look forward to working with him as we move through this process. So thank you very much. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about an epidemic in the American
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Well, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about the epidemic in the American workforce, which has wreaked havoc on our labor markets and caused undue hardship for millions of our nation's workers. I'm talking, of course, about the eradication of the 40-hour work week brought by the so-called, quote, Affordable Care Act, unquote. As a result of this poorly named law, businesses around the country are instituting hiring freezes, downsizing their workforces, or reducing worker hours. As you know, the President's health law requires employers with 50 or more full-time employees to offer health coverage of a minimum value or pay a penalty. One of the unintended but not unforeseen consequences of the law is that a number of employers are opting to unilaterally limit the number of full-time employees in order to escape this burdensome mandate. The Affordable Care Act defines, quote, full-time, unquote, employees as those working at least 30 hours a week. As a result of this odd definition, not every employer seeking to avoid paying penalties is laying off workers. Instead, an increasing number of businesses have opted to simply cap workers' hours. This is happening everywhere, Madam President. For example, a recent Reuters survey of 52 Walmart stores found that half of the stores were only hiring temporary workers, something the stores typically only do during the holiday shopping season. According to a recent article in the Washington Times, Walmart has, overall, increased the share of its temporary staff from between 1% and 2% last year to 10% this year. Keep in mind, Walmart is our nation's largest employer. And though the company has denied that this change in policy is a result of Obamacare, it's hard to believe that this is all just a coincidence. Small businesses are also being impacted. For instance, here is the example cited recently. There is the example cited recently in the Wall Street Journal, where Rod Carstensen, an owner of several Del Taco restaurants in the Denver area, was forced to shift the majority of his workforce from full-time to part-time as a result of Obamacare. Mr. Carstensen previously had 180 full-time employees and only 40 part-time workers. But providing benefits to these workers would have imposed as much as $400,000 additional dollars a year in additional costs. As a result, he is now in the process of switching to 80 full-time and 320 part-time workers, none of which will work more than 28 hours per week. Like I said, this is happening everywhere. It's stupid. According to a survey conducted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, 71% of small businesses say that the President's health law makes it harder to hire new employees. And among small businesses that will be impacted by Obamacare's employer mandate, 50% say that they will either have to cut the hours of workers currently employed full-time or replace their full-time employees with part-timers in order to avoid this vicious mandate. But it's not just happening in the private sector. Public schools, states, and municipalities are also limiting employees to part-time work in order to avoid paying costly benefits. For example, the second-largest school district in my home state of Utah recently implemented a policy limiting part-timers to 29 hours a week. According to the Washington Post, this impacted roughly 1,200 employees, mostly substitute teachers. That's 1,200 employers in a single school district that will see their hours and their wages capped as a result of Obamacare. Likewise, the state of Virginia recently enacted a policy reducing the hours for as many as 10,000 part-time employees that, until recently, worked more than 30 hours a week. Offering coverage of these workers would have cost the state as much as $110 million a year. Understandably, rather than paying those crippling costs, Virginia was forced to reduce workers' hours and therefore their pay, thanks to the demands and officiousness of Obamacare. As I stated, this is reaching epidemic levels. And it makes you wonder what is in the brains of those who support Obamacare. Nationwide, employers have added far more part-time employees in 2013, averaging 93,000 a month than full-time workers, which have averaged 22,000. Last year, the reverse was true. It isn't just businesses that are noticing this epidemic. Labor unions, some of the largest supporters of the law when it was originally drafted, have also weighed in on the matter. As has been widely reported earlier this month, the leaders of 3 prominent labor unions sent a letter to the Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate expressing their concerns about some of the unintended consequences of the, quote, Affordable Care Act, unquote. One of their major concerns was that, in their own words, quote, the law creates an incentive for employers to keep employees' hours below 30 hours a week. Numerous employers have begun to cut workers' hours to avoid this obligation, and many of them are doing so openly. The impact is twofold. Fewer hours means less pay, while also losing our current health benefits, unquote. According to these union leaders, Obamacare threatens to, quote, destroy the foundation of the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class, unquote. I couldn't agree more with them. President Obama is apparently starting to feel some of this pressure. Indeed, despite his recent efforts to paint a rosy picture of the impact of the health care law, I think President Obama knows full well that the Affordable Care Act, or should I say, quote, Affordable Care Act, unquote, is not living up to its name. Why else would he decide to delay the implementation of the employer mandate as he did earlier this month? Obviously, there are political considerations. The recently announced one-year delay on the employer mandate conveniently puts the implementation of the mandate past the 2014 midterm elections. So from that perspective, I guess it makes perfect sense. Setting aside the politics, this delay also makes some sense in terms of policy. The epidemic of employers reducing workers' hours is taking a huge toll on the American workforce. Indeed, the policies established under the health law are killing jobs, reducing wages, and stagnating growth. That being the case, the bigger question is, why is the President only delaying the employer mandate for a single year? Does he really believe these problems will simply go away if businesses have one additional year to prepare? Or is he just thinking of the next election and getting his people through that who have voted for this? Regardless of when this mandate goes into effect, it's going to send shockwaves throughout the business community. It's going to eliminate jobs, and it's going to weaken our recovery, weak though it is today. That's why, despite the announcement of the one-year delay, employers throughout the country are refusing to reverse course when it comes to downsizing their workforces and limiting employees' hours. Most news reports surrounding this issue are showing that this is precisely the case. That's likely the case for the state of Virginia. It's definitely the case for my home state of Utah and Utah's Granite School District, just to mention one aspect of our problems in Utah. If the President is serious about getting our economy back on track, he should work with Congress to ensure this mandate never goes into effect. While we're at it, we should also permanently delay the individual mandate. For the life of me, I can't see why President Obama would extend his limited lifeline to the business community and at the same time leave individuals and their families out in the cold. This is from a president who claims that he's for the families and for the individuals and for the poor and for those who are middle class. They're being left out in the cold. If businesses are currently facing enough difficulties to justify delaying the employer mandate, shouldn't we assume that individuals are going to face similar difficulties complying with the individual mandate? Isn't it only fair that we extend the same benefits to individuals and families that are being offered to businesses and employers? Why not get that beyond the next year's election, too? Not according to the Obama administration. As it stands today, American businesses will get a one-year reprieve from the job-killing employer mandate. American businesses. But the American people are still squarely in the sights of Obamacare as the individual mandate for them remains in place. This is the height of unfairness, Madam President, and it needs to be rectified. The House of Representatives, for its part, has acted responsibly. 2 weeks ago, the House passed two pieces of legislation, relating to Obamacare. The first bill would simply codify President Obama's one-year delay of the employer mandate. And the second would provide similar relief to individuals and families struggling to comply with the individual mandate. Not surprisingly, President Obama has threatened to veto both bills, even the one that would simply put his own administration's policy into statutory form. Still, that shouldn't stop us here in the Senate. Madam President, if we're serious about helping the business community as well as individuals and families, we should work to delay permanently this catastrophic law. If President Obama wants to officially deny the American people the same type of relief he's given to the business community by not working with Congress, then so be it. The Senate needs to act responsibly. If the President is refusing to do the same, we ought at least act responsibly. Make no mistake, Madam President, I don't think that a one-year delay on the employer and individual mandates is enough. We have to get rid of them both. I'm the author of two Senate bills that would repeal both of these egregious provisions of Obamacare. And in light of the President's recent recognition that the employer mandate should be delayed, I have publicly called for a permanent delay of the implementation of the entire law. Given what we know about the problems associated with Obamacare, and quite frankly, given what we don't know, the sensible approach is to delay it permanently and to work together on reforms that will actually lower health care costs. Not just promise to do it, but actually do it. I believe we can fix these problems for everyone, for employers and for individuals alike, but only if the law is permanently delayed to give us a chance to do so. It will give us a chance to be bipartisan for a change around here and work together for the best good of this country. This is what makes sense, and that's what fairness dictates. If we're serious about avoiding what even some of my Democratic friends have called a, quote, train wreck, unquote, that's the least we can do. Madam President, I'm really concerned about our country. We've increased taxes $1 trillion in Obamacare. We've increased taxes $600 billion in the fiscal cliff legislation. And last week, the Majority Leader and others, the President, Majority Leader, Senator Schiffer and others, have called for almost $1 trillion more in tax increases. It'd be one thing if all that money would go to reduce spending, if all that money would go to balance our budget. But no, they're going to spend every dime of it. And here we are, headed towards problems that we have plenty of illustrative information on, problems like Greece has gone through and is going through, and other countries as well who just are profligate when it comes to their economic wherewithal. I like the President personally. But for the life of me, as bright as he is, I don't see why he doesn't see all this. And I really don't see why my colleagues on the other side don't see it. Or should I say, they ought to see it. They ought to know that this is not what the American people really want. They would like to have health care, there's no question. But this is going to diminish health care all over the country. And as we see, a high percentage of doctors are giving up on Medicaid patients, they won't take them anymore. And now, just this week, a high percentage of doctors is giving up on Medicare patients. They don't want to take them anymore. And what's the administration's answer to all these spending programs? Well, they're going to cut the providers. Already the providers, the doctors, the hospitals, the health care providers, are complaining that they can't deliver the services that Obamacare requires at the low-level costs that Obamacare gives. We've got to come up with a better system. We've got to work together. We can't keep going down this pathway. I just hope my friends on the other side will wake up and realize that, hey, this game is over. We've got to find some way to solve these problems because they're just too large. And they're going to wreck our country if we don't. What's worse, they're going to hurt the health care of millions and millions of people who really won't be able to afford it. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, sitting here listening to the distinguished senior senator from Utah, Senator Hatch, who in many ways I consider my mentor in the United States Senate, I couldn't help but reflect on what we were all doing on Christmas Eve at 7 o'clock in the morning, 2009. We were here on the floor of the United States Senate casting a historic vote on the President's Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And sadly, that piece of legislation became a partisan exercise in power, and all the Democrats voted for it, all the Republicans voted against it. It was an inauspicious way to start such an important part of reform of our health care system. And the President pretty well got what he wanted. He got the 2,700-page piece of legislation made into law with trillion-dollar-plus tax increases, with promises that if you like what you have, you can keep it. And he promised that even families of four could see a reduction in their health care costs of roughly $2,500 a year. Well, whether you were against Obamacare from the beginning, like I was, because you never believed it would actually work, or you were for it and you actually believed that it would perform as advertised and as promised, I think everyone has to now acknowledge that it has not turned out the way that even some of its most ardent supporters had hoped it would. The first indication, perhaps, was when the Secretary of Health and Human Services began to issue waivers, in excess of 1,000 waivers, from having to comply with the law itself. And there were many questions about the basis upon which these waivers were issued. Were they given to friends of the administration and denied to adversaries of the administration? But that's what happens when you pass a sweeping piece of legislation like this, and then you cherry-pick who it applies to and who it does not apply to. And that started with the granting of waivers. Well, we found that most recently, even the President of the United States has determined that the employer mandate, the mandate on employers with more than 50 employees that they provide this government-designed insurance policy or else they get fined, that even the President has acknowledged by his action, delaying the implementation of the employer mandate for a year, that it's having a devastating effect on employment in America. The reason we know that is because many employers are simply shedding jobs so they can get beneath the 50-person threshold for the employer mandate, or they're taking full-time jobs and making them into part-time jobs, causing a lot of people who want to work and provide for their families, creating the inability of them to do so according to their needs. And now we know that the individual mandate, the House of Representatives has passed a piece of legislation that says if you're going to delay the employer mandate for businesses, shouldn't you show the same consideration for individual Americans who, unless they buy this government-approved insurance, will have to pay a penalty. The President hasn't accepted that delay in the implementation of the law, but there's another important piece of legislation that I've filed in the Senate that the House is also considering this week, and that is, given the scandals associated with the Internal Revenue Service, the fact that clearly the IRS has more on its plate than it's capable of adequately performing, that we ought to get the Internal Revenue Service out of the implementation of Obamacare, that with everything else that it has to do, especially given the scandals that are currently under investigation in both houses of Congress, we ought to be delaying the implementation of that individual mandate. We ought to be delaying the implementation of the employer mandate. We ought to be cutting the IRS out of the implementation process for Obamacare. Now, I confess I voted against Obamacare from the very beginning, and I voted to repeal it every chance we could possibly have, and I voted to co-sponsor legislation that would defund it. But I just want to echo some of the words of the distinguished senior senator from Utah. At some point, either those of us who are against it from the very beginning and who would like to repeal it and defund it have to work together with our colleagues who perhaps hoped that it would actually work as advertised, realizing now that even organized labor is writing letters to us saying, please protect us from the provisions of this law because it's hurting our jobs, it's making it impossible for us to keep the insurance that we have. So we need to work together to try to come up with a solution at some point when, as a distinguished ranking member, distinguished Finance Committee Chairman, who said the implementation of Obamacare is clearly becoming a train wreck, that we don't visit the pain of that train wreck and that failure on the American people, but we provide them a reasonable alternative which will provide people access to high-quality care at a lower cost. And there are plenty of great ideas out there. Madam President, I want to turn to the appropriations bill that's pending before us. Last week, in another one of the President's much-publicized pivots, the President turned his attention back to the economy. Of course, most Americans don't have the luxury of pivoting to or from this sluggish economy, which is growing at the slowest rate of our economy in American history since the last Depression, the Great Depression. The American people don't have the luxury of pivots. They have to live with this sluggish economy and high unemployment day after day. But we should welcome the President back to this conversation. He's talked a lot about middle-class families, which, as we all would agree, are the backbone of our country and a source of immeasurable strength. That said, the President has been a member of the middle class for some time, and I think he, along with some of our colleagues, could use a refresher. American families set their budgets, and they have to stick with them. In lean times, they trim their budgets, and in times of plenty, they set money aside for the future, should they need it. Astonishingly, this basic principle seems to have been lost on both the President and the author of this legislation. This bill, this underlying appropriation bill, takes the first step toward violating the Budget Control Act, which President Obama himself signed into law in 2011. That law sets very clear limits on spending levels, which the Democratic majority, by bringing this bill to the floor, has chosen to ignore. They ignored it when they wrote their budget earlier this year, and they're ignoring it today with this proposed appropriation bill, which is 11% above the Budget Control Act numbers and 4% above the President's own proposed budget itself. That's $54 billion. That's how much this bill would appropriate in discretionary spending. That's more than $5 billion above the current level of spending for this particular appropriation bill. And as I said, it's more than the President himself has requested. It's more than $10 billion above the House bill, which, unlike this bill, was written in accordance with the existing law. Now, I understand that as a negotiating tactic, why our Democratic friends might think that highballing the House bill is a good negotiating tactic, but it's a total charade. It violates the Budget Control Act, and the American people simply will not go along with it. The American people can't understand why Congress and the federal government are having such a difficult time doing with 2.4% less than we spent before the Budget Control Act went into place. 2.4%. Yet here inside the Beltway, you'll hear people talk about the so-called sequester and the Budget Control Act as if it was the end of the world. Well, it's not. It's called living within your means. And that's what we've tried to do when the law was passed and when President Obama signed it. And I think it's also telling that the majority leader, who basically controls the agenda on the Senate floor, I think it's telling that he chose to bring this particular bill to the floor before the August recess. We could have passed any one of a number of other appropriation bills to fund our veterans' hospitals or to pay our Border Patrol agents. The House and Senate really aren't very far apart on the appropriation bills that would do that. Conceivably, we could have had them on the President's desk by the end of this week. Instead, the majority leader would rather leave them in limbo while attempting to pass this bloated bill, which has zero chance of becoming law. My hope is that we proceed through this next round of fiscal debates, our friends on the other side of the aisle would demonstrate a willingness to operate within the law and the Budget Control Act. Unfortunately, they're not off to a very good start with this particular appropriation bill. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, as breaking the action on the floor of the senators, as senators are back in the chamber, returning from their weekly party caucuses. This afternoon, further debate on National Labor Relations Board nominations. We could also see work on spending for the Transportation and Housing Departments. In the House, members are also debating Transportation and Housing Department funding for next year. They're in a break right now, but you can see the House live on C-SPAN when they return this afternoon. While this quorum call is underway on the floor of the Senate, we'll take you to remarks from earlier today with State Department spokesman John Kerry and Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat and Israeli Representative Tzipi Livni. They discussed the start of a new round of Middle East peace talks from the State Department.
I'm delighted to stand here. I think it's still morning. It is still. With Minister Tzipi Livni and Dr. Sy Barakat, both of whom I've had the privilege of knowing for some period of time and enjoyed working with for all of it. As all of you know, it has taken an awful lot of work and a lot of time to reach this new moment of possibility in the pursuit of an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's taken the leadership of President Obama, who set this process in motion with his historic visit to the region this spring. And then he spoke powerfully about the necessity and possibility of peace, not only to the leaders, but also to citizens who overwhelmingly hope for a better future for their children and for their countries, for their peoples. The President's support for our efforts, including his personal engagement with the parties this morning, has been essential, and I thank him for that. And we had a very positive meeting with the President and the Vice President earlier this morning at the White House. I want to also emphasize that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas have both demonstrated courageous leadership to bring us here. And I commend them for the tough choices that they made in terms of the politics at home. I know the path is difficult. There is no shortage of passionate skeptics. But with capable, respected negotiators like Minister Tzipi Livni and Dr. Sy Barakat, standing side by side here today and last night sharing an iftar meal together with all of us, with their efforts, their expertise and their commitment, I'm convinced that we can get there. We're here today because the Israeli people and the Palestinian people both have leaders willing to heed the call of history. Leaders who will stand strong in the face of criticism and are right now for what they know is in their people's best interests. Their commitment to make tough choices, frankly, should give all of us hope that these negotiations actually have a chance to accomplish something. I'm pleased to report that in the conversations we've had last night and again today, we've had constructive and positive meetings, both meetings with the United States President and also meetings with the parties by themselves. The parties have agreed to remain engaged in sustained, continuous, and substantive negotiations on the core issues, and they will meet within the next 2 weeks in either Israel or the Palestinian territories in order to begin the process of formal negotiation. The parties have agreed here today that all of the final status issues, all of the core issues, and all other issues are all on the table for negotiation. And they are on the table with one simple goal, a view to ending the conflict, ending the claims. Our objective will be to achieve a final status agreement over the course of the next 9 months. The parties also agreed that the two sides will keep the content of the negotiations confidential. The only announcement you will hear about meetings is the one that I just made. And I will be the only one, by agreement, authorized to comment publicly on the talks in consultation, obviously, with the parties. That means that no one should consider any reports, articles, or other, or even rumors reliable unless they come directly from me, and I guarantee you they won't. The United States will work continuously with both parties as a facilitator every step of the way. We all understand the goal that we're working towards. Two states living side by side in peace and security, two states because two proud peoples each deserve a country to call their own. Two states because the children of both peoples deserve the opportunity to realize their legitimate aspirations in security and in freedom, and two states because the time has come for a lasting peace. We all appreciate, believe me, we appreciate the challenges ahead. But even as we look down the difficult road that is before us and consider the complicated choices that we face, we cannot lose sight of something that is often forgotten in the Middle East, and that is what awaits everybody with success. We need to actually change the way we think about compromise in order to get to success. Compromise doesn't only mean giving up something or giving something away. Reasonable, principled compromise in the name of peace means that everybody stands to gain. Each side has a stake in the other's success, and everyone can benefit from the dividends of peace. We simply wouldn't be standing here if the leaders, President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and their designated negotiators, and all of us together didn't believe that we could get there. We can envision a day when Palestinians can finally realize their aspirations for a flourishing state of their own. And the groundbreaking economic initiative that we've been working on with the Quartet and with Tony Blair and others, with the help of the private sector, can help
without objection.
And consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Jennifer Kerr was a single mom who wanted to improve her family's future. In 2009, she signed up at Vatterott College. She thought that was the best way to improve her skills and training and do a better job for her family. She went to the local campus. She told the admissions representative that she wanted to study to become a nurse. The admissions official told her that although the school did not offer a nursing degree, it did offer a medical assistance degree that would allow her to earn $15 to $17 an hour and put her on a fast track to becoming a nurse. After securing more than $27,000 in loans and being in the program for more than a year, Jennifer Kerr learned that she wasn't even enrolled in the medical assistance program. She was in the preliminary medical office assistance program. And if she wanted to continue and pursue the medical assistance degree, she would need another 30 weeks of study and another $10,000 to be paid in tuition. In a gutsy move, Jennifer Kerr sued Vatterott Education Centers for misleading her, even though there was a clause in her contract with the school that said she would never sue the school that if she ever sued the school and lost, she'd be responsible for Vatterott's legal costs. A jury in Missouri decided that the school did deceive Jennifer Kerr, ordered the company to pay back the $27,000 she'd borrowed for tuition and fees. The jury then ordered the company to pay Kerr an additional $13 million in punitive damages. The punitive amount the jury awarded far exceeded the maximum under Missouri law, but it showed the sympathy of the jury for situations like Jennifer Kerr's. She borrowed tens of thousands of dollars to earn a certificate, not even a degree, at a for-profit school that's turned out to be virtually worthless. After she left Vatterott, she tried for 6 months to find full-time employment. Earning her medical office assistant diploma not only put her in debt, but it couldn't land her a job anywhere. Now, take away the court victory, Jennifer Kerr's story is common to an industry, the for-profit school industry, that frequently uses unscrupulous tactics to deceive people who are just trying to get an education. Some trade schools provide quality training for reasonable prices. I acknowledge that. But throughout the for-profit college industry, abuses are well documented. Admissions offices at for-profit schools are often a guise for aggressive sales operations targeting students from low-income families. They end up enrolling with inflated expectations for their employment and salary prospects upon graduating from for-profit colleges. Because 96% of the students who enroll in for-profit colleges take federal student loans, 96 for for-profit colleges, it's 13% for those going to community colleges. 96% of those in for-profit colleges take federal student loans. Nearly all the students who leave these for-profit schools have student debt, even when they don't have a degree or a diploma that can lead to a job. Most for-profit colleges charge significantly more in tuition and expenses than similar programs at community colleges or even state universities. In 2008 and 2009, more than 1 million students started at schools owned by for-profit companies that were examined in an investigation by Senator Tom Harkin and the Senate Health Committee. By mid-2010, 54% of those students that started at these for-profit schools had left school, 54%, without a degree or a certificate. Among associate's degree students, 63% dropped out without a degree. Vatterott made national news itself in 2009 and early 2010 when 3 of the top employees of this for-profit school in the Midwest, including Kevin Earl Woods, the former director of the Kansas City campus, pleaded guilty to a conspiracy to fraudulently obtain federal student grants and loans for students who were ineligible for these loans. The Senate Health Committee looked at Vatterott in the course of Chairman Harkin's investigation of the for-profit industry. What they found was discouraging. In 2009, 88% of the revenue going to this for-profit school was federal money. Of the money it took in, Vatterott spent 12.5% on advertising and marketing, took out 19% of this federal money in profit. Here's another way to look at it. Vatterott, a for-profit school, spent $2,400 per student on instruction in 2009, but it spent $1,343 on marketing and $2,000 it took out in profit for each student. In contrast, public and nonprofit schools generally spend a higher amount per student on actual instruction. By comparison, St. Louis Community College spent $5,000 per student on instruction. Vatterott, $2,400. Jennifer attended the Vatterott campus in Independence, Missouri, which is now closed, but the company continues to operate at Kansas City campus. The default rate on loan repayment for students who attended Vatterott in Kansas City is 25%. 1 out of 4 students who went to this for-profit school default on their student loans. The national average is 15%. Jennifer Kerr fought back and won, but the for-profit college industry won't be cleaned up in the courtroom. Not every student with a bad experience has a strong legal case. Most are just victims of a system that allows unscrupulous schools to collect federal loan and grant money from students regardless of outcomes, heaping debt on these students. Many of those students will carry that debt for a lifetime. When the programs and the schools don't deliver and jobs don't materialize, the student gets the debt, the federal government bears the risk, and the school takes the money and runs. The for-profit sector took in $31 billion in U.S. Department of Education money in 2011. About 1/4 of all the federal aid went to these for-profit schools, even though they only enroll 12% of all the students coming out of high school. I might add one other statistic. The for-profit schools account for 47% of all the student loan defaults in America. 12% of the students, 25% of the federal aid to education, 47% of the student loan defaults. Federal U.S. Department of Education regulations state the schools that engage in substantial misrepresentation about a program, its fees, or its job placement can be denied federal money. And yet Vatterott is not the first school or the only school to substantially mislead these students. Abuses in the for-profit college industry will continue until Congress steps up and does something. It's about time for us to establish some standards of accreditation that apply to all schools across the board. How can you expect a student or a student's family to know whether or not this school that is advertising on the internet or on the buses or on the billboards is a real school or just a phony operation to lure kids into debt, have them drop out, or end up with a worthless diploma? I work with my colleagues who feel as I do on this issue. Senators Tom Harkin and Jack Reed, among others, will continue to tell these stories here on the floor of the Senate in the hopes that when the Senate has its higher ed reauthorization bill, we will finally tackle this for-profit school industry. Last Congress, Senator Tom Harkin joined me in introducing a bill that would include military education benefits in the calculation that limits how much of a school's revenue is derived from federal funding. Today I announced the Defense Appropriations Bill for the next fiscal year. It was reported out of my subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee. We called in representatives from the major services and asked them what's going on with the training of our active service members and their families. And what they told us is more than half of those active service members and their families are going to these same for-profit schools. Some are good. Most are awful. These military men and women and their families are not only wasting their time, they're wasting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity we give them for the proper training and education to prepare them to be even better in the military or to have success in civilian life. And because they are lured into these for-profit schools, they end up wasting their time, wasting their money, many of them deeply in debt. Senator Hagan of North Carolina has proposed banning schools from using federal education dollars for marketing. She's right. Many for-profit schools literally take the federal money to bombard students with messages that entice them to enroll, bringing the schools more federal money. I also want to take a look at this system of accreditation. Our current accreditation system provides a seal of approval for too many schools, many of them for-profit colleges, that is really little more than a license to rake in the federal dollars as opposed to truly educating and training students. I hope Jennifer Kerr's court victory can serve as a wake-up call to Congress so we can work together to correct the worst abuses of this system. On behalf of the taxpayers, we need to be better stewards of federal education money. On behalf of the students, we have to improve a system that may or may not prepare them for a career and may or may not lead to a degree, but almost in every case leads to death. Mr. President, I ask consent that the following statement be placed as a separate part in the record.
Without objection.